In the quiet suburbs of Milwaukee, neighbors thought Jeffrey Dahmer was just another lonely man living a private life. He shopped at the local grocery store. He greeted people politely. He even shared beer with those living nearby. Nobody imagined that inside his small apartment on 924 North 25th Street horrors beyond imagination were unfolding. Horrors that would one day shock not only the city but the entire world. Dahmer's crimes would later earn him a chilling title, the Milwaukee Cannibal. Between 1978 and 1991, he murdered 17 men and boys. But this was not just about murder. Dahmer's acts included dismemberment, necrophilia, and even cannibalism. Details so grotesque that even hardened detectives broke down after stepping into his apartment. This story is not just about his crimes. It is about how Dahmer lived a double life. A life where darkness hid behind normality. It is about the failures of a justice system that overlooked warning signs again and again. And it is about the chilling question that still haunts us today: how could a man like Jeffrey Dahmer exist in plain sight for so long? As the Associated Press later reported, investigators described Dahmer's apartment as a house of horrors, a crime scene so disturbing that crime lab workers needed therapy afterward. And yet, Dahmer's story is not only about his shocking brutality. It is also about the missed opportunities, moments when authorities could have stopped him but didn't. So, let's start at the beginning. Who was Jeffrey Dahmer, and how did a boy from a quiet American family become one of the most infamous serial killers in history? Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At first glance, his childhood looked ordinary. He was the son of Lionel, a research chemist, and Joyce, a homemaker. Yet, those who later studied Dahmer's life pointed out troubling signs very early on. According to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Dahmer was described as an awkward child, often isolated and withdrawn. Teachers said he seemed disengaged, almost invisible in a classroom full of kids. One of the earliest red flags came from his fascination with dead animals. A childhood friend later told Inside Edition that Dahmer would collect roadkill and store animal bones in jars. He wasn't just curious about animals. He was obsessed with what happened inside them, dissecting carcasses, stripping flesh from bones. To most people, it seemed disturbing. To Dahmer, it was just a hobby. Experts in criminology often highlight such behavior as a warning sign. Children who display cruelty or unhealthy fascination with death sometimes develop into violent adults. But in Dahmer's case, these signs went largely unnoticed or ignored. And here lies the haunting irony. As Dahmer entered his teenage years, his odd hobbies were brushed aside as quirks. Yet inside, a much darker curiosity was taking root. Could it be that the seeds of a cannibal were planted in those quiet woods where Dahmer collected dead animals too?
Very polite to adults, dressed very nice, very respectful to teachers. Did his work. He could be an A student if he wanted to. Other times he would fail a class because he had no interest. He could be very polite with very good manners. Yes, sir. No, sir, when he spoke with teachers.
By the time Dahmer reached high school, his behavior had shifted in ways that classmates would never forget. On the surface, he played the role of a class clown. He would imitate people with disabilities, stumble through hallways, and pull bizarre stunts to gain attention. His peers even coined the phrase "doing a Dahmer" for his strange antics. But behind the laughter, Jeffrey was spiraling. He began drinking heavily, sometimes even smuggling alcohol into class.
first period, I believe, history class, and he had a styrofoam cup of scotch, I believe it was scotch. And I remember saying, "Jeff, what is that?" And he threw his head back and he shook it and he said, "It's my medicine." But clearly he was getting drunk at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Teachers reported him appearing drunk during lessons, though most dismissed it as teenage rebellion. More chilling, however, were the fantasies forming in Dahmer's mind. According to the FBI case files later released, Dahmer confessed that as a teenager, he began imagining controlling men, having them completely under his power, fantasies that included violence and possession.
Engage with people. So if you don't engage with people, then you give and take of conversation and feelings, then you end up internalizing a lot. You fantasize a lot. And then the next step is to think that some of those fantasies may be real.
His parents' troubled marriage only added fuel to his loneliness. When Jeffrey was 18, his parents divorced, leaving him alone in the family home. It was during this period of abandonment that Dahmer committed his first murder. The victim was Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker. On June 18, 1978, Dahmer lured Hicks to his home with the promise of beer. After hours of drinking, Hicks wanted to leave, but Dahmer couldn't bear the idea of him going. In his confession later to police, Dahmer admitted, "I didn't want him to leave." That desire turned fatal. Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a dumbbell, strangled him, and later dismembered his body. According to the New York Times, investigators noted that Dahmer crushed the bones of Hicks with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woods behind his house. No trace of Hicks was ever found until Dahmer himself confessed years later. This first killing was not a sudden act of rage. It was a calculated choice, a dark fantasy becoming reality, and chillingly, it was only the beginning. At first, the army seemed like a fresh start. But soon, disturbing reports emerged. According to testimony reported by The Independent, 2 fellow soldiers accused Dahmer of drugging and sexually assaulting them during his service in Germany. The army eventually discharged him for alcohol abuse. After leaving the army, Dahmer returned to civilian life, but the urges never left him. He struggled to keep jobs, battled his addiction, and continued fantasizing about total control over others. Yet, for nearly a decade after Stephen Hicks, Dahmer didn't kill again. Some criminologists argue that this cooling-off period is not uncommon among serial killers. They test themselves, pause, and later return to killing with even greater brutality. And that's exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer did. In 1987, after almost 9 years of silence, Dahmer killed again. This time, his crimes would accelerate, each one more gruesome than the last. But what triggered Dahmer's return to murder after so many years? That mystery leads us directly into the next chapter of his story. In 1987, Dahmer's dark urges resurfaced. After nearly a decade of silence, he struck again. His victim was Stephen Tuomi, a 25-year-old man Dahmer met at a bar in Milwaukee. Dahmer later told police that he had no memory of killing him. He only remembered waking up to find Tuomi lifeless beside him. This time, however, Dahmer's actions escalated. He purchased a large suitcase, transported the body to his grandmother's house, and began the gruesome process of dismemberment.
The fact that he was in control of his own little world, that nobody knew what was going on, that he was the master of it,
Dahmer could fit in with any group, and you wouldn't say, oh, he must be crazy, or he must be a killer. That's why he was so successful.
He put some sleeping pills in his drink to render him conscious. And was just going to spend the night with him. When I woke up in the morning, my forearms were bruised, and his chest was bruised, and blood was coming out of his mouth. He was hanging over the side of the bed, and I have no memory of beating him to death, but I must have. The obsession went into full swing.
He decided after that second death that he would no longer attempt to control his desires, that he would give full rein to them, yield entirely to them, and after that his life became the pursuit of unmitigated sexual pleasure.
Unlike his first murder years earlier, Dahmer was now developing rituals. He preserved body parts. He photographed the process. He wanted souvenirs, reminders of control and possession. According to the Milwaukee Journal, investigators later recovered dozens of these photos, each one capturing Dahmer's chilling obsession with keeping his victims close, even after death. By 1988, Dahmer's grandmother began to notice foul smells and suspicious behavior. But Dahmer excused it as spoiled meat or dead animals. When complaints grew louder, he rented his own apartment. This move would mark the beginning of the most horrifying chapter of his crimes. Within that small apartment, Dahmer created what journalists later called a private laboratory of death. Here, he experimented with ways to make his victims permanently submissive. He drilled into skulls, injected chemicals, and attempted to create what he described as living zombies. Neighbors occasionally reported strange noises, chemical odors, and even screams. But their concerns were either dismissed or ignored by authorities. Later, the New York Times reported that police had even returned one of Dahmer's victims, a 14-year-old boy named Konarak Sinthasompone, back to him, after mistaking the boy for an intoxicated lover. That mistake would become one of the most shocking failures in law enforcement history. By the late 1980s, Dahmer's killing spree was accelerating. He had perfected a method that made him nearly invisible to suspicion. He would visit bars, lure young men with the promise of money, alcohol, or photographs, and then take them back to his apartment. Most never returned. Central to this routine was Dahmer's old Volkswagen Beetle. Neighbors recalled seeing him drive around Milwaukee late at night, hunting for victims. Investigators would later call it the deadliest car in America. On the outside, it looked ordinary. But on the inside, it became a trap, a vehicle that carried men to their final destination. According to court transcripts cited by the Washington Post, Dahmer admitted that he often kept victims in the car for hours before bringing them upstairs, carefully calculating the right moment to strike. This chilling detail highlighted how deeply premeditated his crimes had become. Inside the apartment, the killings grew more brutal and frequent. Dahmer began collecting body parts, skulls, bones, and even entire skeletons. He arranged them like trophies, creating a shrine of death. Detectives later told Associated Press reporters that Dahmer admitted to wanting a private temple where he could feel power over his victims even after death. The scale of his crimes was staggering. By 1991, neighbors had repeatedly complained about smells and strange noises. Yet, time after time, authorities dismissed these warnings. One neighbor even described to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel how she called police multiple times, only to be told it was probably just spoiled food. But behind those apartment walls, Dahmer's crimes were escalating into something almost unimaginable: cannibalism. He confessed to cooking and eating parts of his victims, claiming it made him feel like they would remain a part of him forever. On the night of July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer made the mistake that would finally end his reign of terror. That evening, he met 32-year-old Tracy Edwards at a Milwaukee bar. Dahmer lured him back to his apartment with the promise of drinks and money. But once inside, Edwards quickly realized something was terribly wrong. The smell was overwhelming. A foul stench of decay that clung to the air. Edwards later told the Associated Press that he noticed boxes of acid, a strange blue drum in the corner, and a chilling collection of knives near the bed. But the most terrifying moment came when Dahmer snapped a handcuff onto Edwards' wrist and pulled out a knife. For nearly 5 hours, Edwards tried to stay calm, talking to Dahmer, looking for a chance to escape. At one point, Dahmer pressed the knife against his chest and told him he intended to consume his heart. Finally, in a moment of courage, Edwards saw his chance. He struck Dahmer, bolted out the door, and ran through the streets in handcuffs until he flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers. That desperate run would expose the nightmare inside apartment 213. Hen Edwards explained what happened. The officers were skeptical at first, but they agreed to follow him back to Dahmer's apartment. What they found would haunt them forever. According to court records later summarized by the Washington Post, one officer entered the bedroom and noticed a drawer partially open. Inside were Polaroid photographs, dozens of them showing men in various stages of dismemberment. At first, the officer thought they were artistic images. But then the reality set in. They were real. Dahmer had documented his crimes step by step. The officer shouted to his partner, "These are for real." In that instant, Dahmer realized his secret life was over. He fought to escape, but the officers subdued him. Within minutes,
The look of terror and almost hysteria that he had on his face in the interrogation room that first night as he was coming down off the alcohol and finally realizing that the gig was up. He was caught. He did cry several times. He went into a rage. Besides asking to kill himself, he stood up and pounced around a couple times. He made this statement: "When I tell you what I'm going to tell you, you're going to be famous." And I tried to say, "Look, Jeff, there's nothing that you can tell me that is going to freak me out." And he laughed at that. He said, "You don't know what I've done."
the officer shouted to his partner, "These are for real." In that instant, Dahmer realized his secret life was over. He fought to escape, but the officers subdued him. Within minutes, squad cars swarmed the building. Neighbors crowded the street, confused and horrified. For years, they had smelled strange odors, complained about noise, but no one imagined that a serial killer, a cannibal, had been living right among them. This was the beginning of one of the most infamous crime scene investigations in American history. The officers who stepped into apartment 213 that night described it as something out of a nightmare. What began as a routine call quickly turned into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in U.S. history. Inside the refrigerator, investigators found a freshly severed head. In the freezer, 3 more human heads, carefully wrapped in plastic. According to the Associated Press coverage from 1991, detectives also recovered multiple human hearts, preserved for consumption. And that was just the beginning. In a 57-gallon blue drum filled with acid, they discovered 3 torsos dissolving. Skulls, bones, and entire skeletons were scattered across closets and drawers. Police later testified that the stench inside the apartment was so overwhelming that officers had to take turns stepping outside for air. A later report by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel revealed that crime lab workers assigned to catalog the remains required counseling afterward, because of the sheer psychological trauma. Even seasoned detectives said they had never seen anything so grotesque. But Dahmer hadn't just killed. He had documented everything. Dozens of Polaroid photos showed his victims before and after death. Some posed in eerie positions, others captured in the process of being dismembered. These photographs became some of the most chilling evidence ever presented in a courtroom. As the news spread, shockwaves rippled through Milwaukee. Neighbors who had once shared beers with Dahmer were stunned to discover what he had been hiding. One neighbor told ABC News that she thought the foul smell was from spoiled meat, never imagining it was from human remains. Reporters flooded the scene, and within hours, headlines across America declared the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree. The media labeled him the Milwaukee Cannibal. Crowds gathered outside the Oxford apartments, struggling to comprehend that so much horror had been concealed inside a single unit. But beyond the gruesome discoveries, one detail stood out: for years, Dahmer had been able to operate in plain sight. Complaints were ignored. Police had been called more than once to his apartment but left without searching properly. Even more disturbing, months earlier, officers had returned a 14-year-old boy, one of Dahmer's victims, back to his custody, dismissing the pleas of neighbors who had tried to intervene. The revelation of these failures turned the Dahmer case into more than just a serial killer story. It became a chilling indictment of systemic negligence of a justice system that had countless chances to stop him, but didn't. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began in January 1992, and from the very first day, it was unlike anything the American justice system had seen before. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' families, and curious onlookers. Outside, television crews broadcast every moment, turning the trial into a national spectacle. Dahmer faced 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin alone, though investigators believed his true number of victims could have been higher. According to the New York Times coverage of the trial, Dahmer appeared calm and almost expressionless throughout the proceedings, a stark contrast to the gruesome details being presented. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded predator who lured victims and destroyed lives without remorse. They brought forward evidence collected from his apartment: skulls, photographs, cooking utensils, and detailed confessions. Jurors were shown Polaroid images too disturbing for the public, but necessary to prove the scope of his crimes. Dahmer's defense team, however, argued that he was insane, that no sane man could commit such acts. They leaned heavily on psychiatric evaluations, with one doctor testifying that Dahmer was driven by uncontrollable compulsions, not rational choices. The question that gripped the courtroom was simple yet haunting: was Jeffrey Dahmer evil, or was he mentally ill? The testimonies were gut-wrenching. Family members of victims stood before the jury, describing the pain of losing sons, brothers, and friends in such a horrific way. One mother told Associated Press reporters that she wanted Dahmer to feel just a fraction of the pain he caused.
Jeffrey, I hate you! I hate you! Jeffrey's not in control! Don't Jeffrey, I kill you! Don't get me, Mother! I kill you! What's your name, man?
Perhaps the most unforgettable moment came during sentencing. Rita Isbell, the sister of one of Dahmer's victims, erupted in grief and rage, screaming at Dahmer in open court. Her outburst, captured on live television, became one of the most iconic images of the trial. In the end, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Dahmer was found legally sane and guilty on all counts. In February 1992, Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 957 years in prison. According to court records, Dahmer responded with a chilling calmness, saying, "I know my time in prison will be long. I deserve whatever I get." Outside the courtroom, crowds cheered the verdict. For many, justice had finally been served. But for others, the trial left deeper questions unanswered. How could someone this disturbed go unnoticed for so long? How many warning signs had been ignored, and could such horrors ever happen again? Section 9, Chunk A. After his sentencing in 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Despite the enormity of his crimes, Dahmer did not receive solitary confinement for life. According to the Washington Post, he was placed in protective custody at first but later moved into the general prison population. Surprisingly, Dahmer became somewhat of a notorious figure among inmates. Some feared him, others mocked him. Guards reported that he developed a dark sense of humor about his crimes. The New York Times quoted correctional officers saying Dahmer would shape food into body part-like forms or leave ketchup smeared as fake blood, disturbing both staff and prisoners. He also claimed to have found religion in prison. According to Inside Edition interviews with his pastor, Dahmer asked to be baptized in 1994, stating he hoped for forgiveness. But many doubted the sincerity of this conversion, questioning if it was another manipulation tactic. Still, despite his calm demeanor, Dahmer was a target. His presence unsettled both guards and inmates, and there were constant fears that someone might take justice into their own hands. That fear became reality on November 28, 1994. On that morning, Dahmer and two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, were assigned to work detail in the prison gym bathroom. According to Associated Press reports, there were no guards directly supervising them at the time. Minutes later, guards returned to find Dahmer and Anderson brutally beaten. Both men had been attacked with a steel bar taken from prison equipment. Dahmer was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at a nearby hospital. Christopher Scarver later told the New York Post in a 2015 interview that he killed Dahmer because of his disturbing behavior in prison, mocking his crimes, taunting other inmates, and showing no real remorse. Scarver said, "Some people deserve to die. Dahmer was one of them." News of Dahmer's death spread worldwide. Outside the prison, families of victims expressed relief, some calling it the justice the courts could never truly deliver. Others believed his death robbed them of the chance to continue questioning him and understanding why he committed such horrific acts. With Dahmer's murder, one of the darkest chapters in American crime history came to a violent end. Yet, even in death, his name continued to haunt the public imagination, a reminder of how evil can exist behind the most ordinary of faces. Jeffrey Dahmer's death in 1994 did not mark the end of his story. In many ways, it was only the beginning of his legacy, one filled with fear, fascination, and painful lessons. For years, criminologists, psychologists, and journalists studied Dahmer's life to understand how an ordinary-looking man could commit such extraordinary horrors. According to a feature in Time magazine, experts described Dahmer as a chilling contradiction, polite and intelligent on the outside, yet consumed by unimaginable darkness on the inside. His crimes forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions about evil. Was Dahmer simply born a monster, or was he shaped by neglect, alcoholism, and family dysfunction? Could his crimes have been prevented if the justice system or society had intervened earlier? Dahmer's case also exposed shocking failures in law enforcement. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel documented how police ignored warnings from neighbors, even returning a 14-year-old boy, Konarak Sinthasampon, back to Dahmer after the child had escaped. Hours later, the boy was murdered. This moment became a symbol of missed opportunities, a haunting reminder of systemic negligence. But beyond the failures, Dahmer's story lives on as a cultural phenomenon. Books, films, and documentaries continue to revisit his life, not to glorify him, but to explore the darkest corners of human psychology. His name has become synonymous with evil, joining the ranks of history's most infamous serial killers. And yet, the fascination with Dahmer reveals something about us too. Why are we drawn to such horrifying stories? Perhaps because they force us to face the thin line between normalcy and monstrosity. They remind us that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes, they wear the mask of a friendly neighbor, a quiet co-worker, or even a man who shares a beer with you at the end of the day. As one criminologist told The Guardian, the true horror of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just what he did, but how ordinary he looked while doing it. And so, we are left with questions that may never have answers. How many more warnings do we ignore in everyday life? How do we protect society from the evil that hides in plain sight? And most of all, how do we make sure the victims are never forgotten? Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Dahmer was born a monster, or shaped by the circumstances of his life? And which story should we cover next? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories.